You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. The Christian presence in Syria can be traced back to the very early days of Christianity. To this day, Christians play a critical role in economics, politics, culture, art, and society in Syria. But there was a moment where this nearly 2,000-year Christian presence could have come to an end. In 1860, following the outbreak of the Mount Lebanon civil war, Christian communities were being massacred across what is today Lebanon, and this violence reached Damascus. 2,500, or about 15% of Damascus's Christian population, were killed over the course of 8 days in July that year. In the words of Oxford historian Eugene Rogan, the Damascus Massacre was a genocidal moment, but it was not a genocide. Indeed, some 85% of Damascus's Christians were saved by their Muslim neighbours, and the Ottomans imposed harsh punishments on the perpetrators of the massacres. But what actually happened in Damascus in 1860, and what lessons does it have to teach us today? Rogan joins us today to discuss his new book, The Damascus Events, the 1860 Massacre and the Destruction of the Ottoman World, Penguin University Press. Eugene, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Osman, a pleasure to be with you.
So Eugene Rogan is a professor of modern Middle Eastern history at Oxford University, where he taught since 1991, a fellow at St Anthony's College and director of the Middle Eastern Centre. He took his BA in economics from Columbia and his MA and PhD in the Middle Eastern history from Harvard. In 2017, he was elected a Fellow of the British Academy. He is the author of The Arabs, A History, which was published in 2009, and there was also another print in 2017, named as the best book of 2009 by The Economist, Financial Times, and The Atlantic Monthly. His new book, I think this is quite an old biography, I must say. It says his new book, The Fall of the Ottomans, The Great War in Middle East in 2015, that is not his new book, was named a best book of 2015 by The Economist and The Wall Street Journal. It's a very good book, though. You should check it out. His early works include The Frontiers and the State in the Late Ottoman Empire, Cambridge University Press, 1999, of which he received the Albert Hourani Book Award of the Middle Eastern Studies Association of North America, and Fuad, oh God, this is a Turkish name, Fuad Kaparoli Prize of the Turkish Studies Association, and The War for Palestine, Rewriting the History of the 1948, Cambridge University Press, 2001, second edition 2007 with Avi Schleim. His works are translated into 18 languages. I hope the Turkish speaking audience does forgive me for the pronunciation there. That part there, I am studying Turkish at the minute, so I can imagine my Turkish teacher just hitting their head against the wall. But enough about me. So Eugene, I would like to sort of start with right at the beginning. What made you sort of decide, you wanted to do this piece of history? What made you decide to want to do this? You did this over a long period of time, but could you perhaps tell us why you wrote this book?
Well, Osman, as I say in the opening of the book, this is a project that's taken 35 years to come to fruition. And the first inspiration to take on the Damascus events was a chance discovery in the American archives way back in 1989, when still as a doctoral candidate, I was doing research into the consular reports from Damascus and from Jerusalem for the light that they might shed on events going on in Transjordan at that time, just coming under Ottoman direct rule for the first time. And the first person appointed as vice consul to the United States was a leading intellectual from Syria. His name is Mikhail Mishaka. He was a very well-established author, polemicist, autodidact. So something of a famous name then as now. In fact, just before I went to the archives, a great translation of Mishaka's history, which in Arabic he called Al-Jawab al-Iqtirah al-Ahbab, or the response to the suggestion of the loved ones, but which Wheeler Thaxton gave the far more salacious title, Murder, Mayhem, Pillage, and Plunder. And so, having been armed with, reading the translation of Mishaka's book, seeing that he was the man who opened America's first mission in Damascus, I was very excited to lay hold of his reports, which began in 1859. But when I called them up in the archive, the archivist just couldn't find them. And after many false attempts, they invited me to go back into the stacks, an experience in its own right. And while there, I chanced upon 3 locally sourced notebooks that, entirely in Arabic, carried the first 3 volumes of consular correspondence from Damascus. So it was discovering a whole set of documents that, because there was nothing in English to guide the archivist in how to catalog them, had until then been lost in the archive. For all I know, the last person to be flipping the pages would have been Mikhail Mishaka or his son and successor Nassif Mishaka, which was just a very exciting moment and really inspired me to want to address the history of 1860 and what followed.
Indeed, it was from what you write, it was a very big, momentous event in 1860. But let's take a little bit of a step back before we get to the 1860 moment, because the story of people like Mikhail Mishak is the story of what was happening in that region, even just prior to it. So in 1820s, we start to see the shifting in sort of cultural and religious relations within the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the Levant region. And a number of changes were coming in. So I wonder if you could sort of just talk us through what those changes were and how it sort of challenged what went before.
Well, let me sketch for you schematically the big earthquakes that were to really shake society and economy in Ottoman Damascus in the first half of the 19th century. And I think the first real seismic shift came with the invasion of the Syrian lands by the armies of the Egyptian governor Muhammad Ali or Mehmed Ali Pasha. This was one Ottoman governor from Cairo invading his sultan's lands in Damascus and points north. And the success of Egyptian arms allowed the Egyptians to rule over Syria for the better part of a decade through the 1830s. And it was a time of tremendous upheaval for the people in not just Damascus, but across the Syrian lands, as Syria came under effectively Egyptian rather than Ottoman rule. This meant granting not just legal equality, but also equal responsibilities or burdens on Muslims and non-Muslims alike, subverting an order in which the Muslim majority were the first-class citizens, and then the non-Muslim minorities, like the Christians and the Jews, were protected and respected, but distinctly second-class citizens. The Egyptians already began to subvert that and began to break the link between the people of Damascus and their sovereign, the Sultan in Istanbul. With the restoration of Ottoman rule after 1840, the changes taking place in the Mediterranean world would be the next source of tension in Damascus. And here it's really the arrival of European industrial goods. The second industrial revolution is already underway in Europe, bringing cheap woolens and woven fabrics and cottons to a city like Damascus, which until that point had relied on its own weaving industry for its fabric needs. And the ships bringing these European industrial products to fill their holds going back were taking back grain, they were taking back cotton, they were taking back wool and silk, draining the kind of primary sources out of the Syrian market. If you like, this put Damascene producers under a double strain. Their prices of finished goods were being pushed lower by competition from European industrial goods, but the price of primary products, what they relied on for their own weavings, was going up as European markets were just sucking up all of the surplus wool and cotton and silk that Syria was producing. And the only people benefiting from this were the Christian communities hired by European trading houses to serve as their agents and intermediaries. And Christian households were growing increasingly wealthy on the back of this accelerating Mediterranean trade from Europe. So that would be the second. And then the third tension is where European trade leads, of course, the consular agencies follow. And you get the advent of European consuls opening their doors in Damascus starting in the late 1830s and early 1840s. And this was very destabilizing to Damascus because suddenly these consuls came and began to hire local clerks, translators or tarjumans, dragomans as they were called in the West, guards who protected the missions. And these tended to go to local Christians or local Jews who then benefited from all the privileges and extraterritoriality that Europeans did. So here again, you see a change in which the beneficiaries are the minority communities and where those disadvantaged are the Muslim majority. All of this subverting, if you like, the social hierarchy. And if the Muslims of Damascus hoped that maybe the Ottoman state would have their backs and protect them against these changes, they found that the reforms being pursued by the Ottoman Sultan and his government were actually confirming some of the changes that were empowering the minority communities. None more so than 1856, when one of the landmark legislation of the Ottoman reforms of the Tanzimat conferred equality before the law on Christians and Jews along with Muslims. And this legal equality, coming at a time where Christians and Jews were getting consular and economic privileges, only served to reinforce the assertiveness of these communities, challenging a hierarchy centuries old that was creating murderous resentments among the Muslim majority community.
It wasn't just the Equality Acts as well. I mean, you in the book, you sort of outline that what you started to sort of see is if there was, say, a dispute between, say, a Christian and a Muslim, let's say a mercantile dispute or any kind of dispute, if they were associated with a European consulate, they could go to the European consulate and have their case judged.
Exactly.
And more often than not, the consular courts would sort of side with the Christian individual bringing the sort of complainant, and there was very little the Ottomans could sort of do about this in effect. And so there was also unfair punishment on the Muslim residents in this sort of case. And so that sort of adds to this sort of feeling that things are, that Muslims are losing, not just losing privilege, but they're be losing out entirely, which was a big theme in the book that I found.
It was. I mean, it was almost the mid-19th century equivalent of those conspiracy theories of a great replacement that drives a lot of the right wing in North America and in Europe today. There's a sense that there was a great replacement going on in Ottoman Damascus, with Christians and Jews coming out ahead of Muslims in a way which subverting a long-established social hierarchy. And this created really extreme tensions in Damascene society. It's hard for us to capture what sounds like such benign developments to us today, why these changes were so threatening and came to define the Christian community as a real problem to mid-19th century Damascenes.
So talk to us about America at this period, because Mashhad becomes this sort of consular for the Americans. What was it about him that made America interested in him, and why did they hire someone local rather than sending someone out?
Well, it's easy to assume that America in the 1850s and 60s is the same country we think of today, but America was a minor power in the mid-19th century. Its states spanned the east to west coast, but it was still a very small and inward-looking global presence. And the Ottomans really paid very little attention to the United States. It was, more than a quarter of a century after the first American mission sent to Constantinople before the Ottomans saw fit to reciprocate and send a mission to open an embassy in Washington, D.C. And this minor American state was itself quite divided. In 1859, at the time they appointed Mishaka, the debates between northern and southern states over slavery and state rights were already leading to really deep cleavages that kind of worked against America being able to project power abroad. It was really focused on divisions at home. So the United States looked to a remote and exotic state like the Ottoman Empire, could only afford to send a certain number of U.S. citizens to represent its foreign service. And so what they tended to do was post an American to a central post, in this case, Beirut. That was where the consul general was based. and then to rely on local Syrian Christians to serve as their consular agents in smaller or inland towns. And in this way, towns like Tripoli, Latakia, Tyre, Sidon, Haifa, even Damascus, all came under local consular agents, most of whom couldn't speak a word of English, filed their reports in Arabic, where they would arrive in Beirut and be interpreted by a translation bureau for the benefit of the American consul general in Beirut. So Mishaka fit into that network. And I think what most recommended him to the Americans was the fact that he had chosen to abandon his native Greek Catholic faith and to adhere to the Protestant Christian faith as preached by American missionaries. He was, in a sense, the greatest success that the American Presbyterian missionaries had achieved to date, winning over a man that they all widely acclaimed as the best educated man in all of Syria. And he chose their faith because it so fulfilled his wish to find a rational Christianity stripped of the kind of practices and what he would say mythological beliefs that were promulgated by the priests of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Greek Catholic Church. But his decision to leave the church and become a Protestant was to set off a real conflict with the patriarch of the Greek Catholic Church, which the American Protestants are only too happy to publish volume by volume. There were a good 6 or 8 volumes of diatribes capturing the debate between the patriarch and Mishaka, which really captured his central role and why he became the kind of the first choice candidate to represent the United States in Syria.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting actually, because that is another theme within the book, that, you know, the sort of arrival of European and American missionaries and consular services and expansion of power in the Middle East also produced tensions within Christian communities, because especially with missionaries coming in, such as Protestant missionaries, that are challenging the religious order of the churches there, and then you start to see subtle changes happening to sort of Christian practices in the Middle East as a result of that tension as well. So there's another tension there, isn't there?
There was, and you could really trace tensions emerging because of the work of missionaries through all the different denominations. And remember, both Syria and Mount Lebanon are some of the most diverse religiously of all the communities of the Ottoman Empire, with, again, I can't give you the precise figure, whether it's 8 or 12 different denominations of the Christian faith alone. And for Western missionaries, American Presbyterians, also British missionaries from the Church Missionary Society, you had the Irish Presbyterians in Damascus. They recognized that they couldn't make headway in trying to gain converts from Muslim Syrians. The risks were too high. Apostasy was grounds for death punishment in the Ottoman Empire. So the only real people they could hope to gain converts from would be either other Christian denominations or the Jewish community. And in this, I think the activities of missionaries set off tremendous tensions between the different denominations in Syria and Lebanon.
Indeed, and that sort of brings us a little bit to the actual Mount Lebanon civil war, because as I sort of understood it, there was essentially, it starts off in what we call Mount Lebanon, which is today Lebanon. See, there's no specific mount called Mount Lebanon. And we have particularly, it starts off between the Druze. It's sort of known as the sort of Druze Maronite War, but it's actually more Druze. There was a kind of, what would you describe it as, a coup against the then leader of the Druze, then replaced by the Jumblats? Or how would you sort of describe what happened? Because Jumblat becomes the leader of the Druze in Lebanon, replacing the previous one. But would you describe that as a coup? How would you describe what happened there, actually?
Well, in a sense, the Druze community found themselves disadvantaged during the Egyptian occupation of the 1830s. The Egyptians had wanted to disarm and conscript all the residents of Mount Lebanon. In this, I think the Druze decided to not comply. The Maronites went along with Egyptian demands. And soon the Druze found themselves under pressure from their Maronite neighbors under Egyptian rule that drove them to leave Mount Lebanon and to take refuge in the highlands to the south of Damascus in a place that was then called Jebel al-Arab, but has now come to be known as Jebel Druze. So the origins of the Druze settlement of Jebel Druze in Syria dates back to this period. But as they abandoned their lands and their homes in Mount Lebanon, the Maronites redistributed these goods to their own people. With the Egyptian withdrawal after 1840-41, the Druze begin to return back to Mount Lebanon to find that the super-empowered Maronites are blocking their access to their old lands and refusing to restore the Druze to the positions of power that they had known and enjoyed prior to the Egyptian occupation. And the thing we forget is that the Maronites outnumbered the Druze significantly. So the Druze are actually the compact minority here. The numbers by 1860 suggest that you had about 50,000 armed Christian men and about 18,000 armed Druze men. And the Maronites and other Christian churches had increasingly come to assert a Christian claim to Mount Lebanon and began to call for driving the Druze out altogether. At the same time, you had a kind of social uprising taking place among Maronite Christians themselves as the farmers and workers began to reject the former ruling princes who had dominated their lives in a very feudal way. And in the aftermath of the Egyptian withdrawal from Mount Lebanon, the establishment of a new order to govern Mount Lebanon, these princely families had no real authority anymore. And in 1858, you saw a kind of social revolution break out. And that challenge between the ruling families and the working classes, the sort of 95% of the working people of Mount Lebanon taking on the princely families, was something that the Druze are very clear to avoid in their own communities, that they did not wish to see the Druze peasants and farmers and workers reject the authority of the families like the Jumblets. So if anything, rather than a coup taking place, it was a consolidation. The Druze consolidating the link between their leading families and the masses of the Druze community, and taking on the threat that the Maronites are posing to expel them from their lands once and for all. They go on the offensive and, using stealth and trickery, are able to lay siege to mixed towns and Christian strongholds one after another in May and June of 1860 that would give rise to massacres that would in the end claim as many as 11,000 Christian lives, where the Druze, once on a roll, having stunned the Christian communities of Mount Lebanon, filled them with fear and drove them into retreat before the murderous machine that moved through Mount Lebanon and ends with the siege and conquest of the mixed Christian town of Zahli, mostly Greek Catholic like Mishaka rather than Maronite, but the last real Christian stronghold that might have posed a risk to the new Druze ascendancy over southern Shuf territories, Wadi Taim, and the eastern Bekaa. So here we saw, if you like, the Druze having identified their Christian problems and the antagonisms of the Maronite community threatening to drive the Druze minority from the southern Mount Lebanon altogether. They found the solution in extermination. And I think that is the link that's going to really play on the tensions in Damascus and give rise to a murderous tension that would soon explode in Damascus.
Yes, and during the actual Mount Lebanon Civil War, before it sort of reaches Damascus, this figure, Emir Abdelkadir, appears, who is this Algerian freedom fighter from Algeria, him and his men are now in Damascus, living in Damascus. But he sort of goes to the Druze leader Jumblat and tries to negotiate with them to sort of bring an end to the fighting in Mount Lebanon. Talk to us a little bit about this meeting.
Well, Emir Abdelkadir, as you say, was a recognized hero right across not just the Arab world, but Europe and North America as well. There was so much respect for the resistance he led for a good 15 years to the French occupation of his homeland in Algeria, fighting until he was finally captured in Morocco in 1847 and then thrown in jail in France. And when he was finally released after the fall of the Orleans monarchy in 1848, he was allowed to leave France, go into exile to the Ottoman Empire on the pledge that he would never return to Algeria, never take arms against France. And Abdelkadir seemed to have developed a bond with Louis Napoleon, later Emperor Napoleon III, and he respected that commitment and become something of a French protege. He's actually put on a retainer by the French, and he's feted everywhere he goes in France as something of a Saladin figure, the noble adversary who had fought so valiantly against the French and was now their ally and their friend. And ultimately, in 1855, he decides to settle in the Syrian lands where he could speak his native Arabic, even if his dialect from Algeria would have been quite different from that of the Syrian lands. He'd traveled widely as a young man through the Arab world and felt very much at home with the Arabic language. And he arrives in Beirut and makes his way over the Mount Lebanon, Jebel Lubnan, and on his way, he's received by a delegation of the Druze who invite him to spend a night with them. And I discuss this encounter between Emir Abdelkadir, who I describe as the most famous Arab in the world, and the Druze who could have unveiled to him the very grievances I've just outlined to you about a Maronite ascendancy threatening their very presence in Mount Lebanon. And they left with a very strong bond of friendship. Abdelkadir moving on from Mount Lebanon towards Damascus, where he was going to take up his residency. And that meant that when tensions developed in Mount Lebanon and began to overflow towards Damascus itself, Abdelkadir was able to reach out to his Druze friends to try and bargain with them, to try and avoid a reproduction of the violence of Mount Lebanon from taking place in the growing tensions in Damascus itself. And while he was ultimately unsuccessful in preventing an outbreak of violence, he was very much prepared for any eventuality should violence break out. And in that sense, his preparation meant that he was in a position to prevent the genocidal moment of Damascus from actually developing into a full-fledged extermination of the Christians.
Yes, I'm going to come on to the Damascus event now, but I wonder if you can sort of sketch it out for us a little bit more. I mean, at the time of the revolt in 1860, that would lead to the massacre. You had a situation which you describe in the book where the Central Ottoman state had very few troops actually in Damascus at the time. They'd been sent elsewhere, deployed elsewhere, and so it was quite thinly sort of guarded. But obviously they are relying on the local governor, Ahmed Pasha, to sort of keep order. And as the sort of reports are coming into Damascus, as you sort of describe in the book, about these massacres taking place, it sort of sets off an idea among some of the Muslims in Damascus that, the Druze are having success. You know, maybe we might be more successful if we were to engage in something similar. And it sort of coincides with the rise of rumours, right? So there's rumours flying around Damascus that there is an impending massacre of Muslims about to happen. I believe it was on Eid, in the run-up to Eid, that there was a fear that there was going to be some kind of Christian ambush. Talk to us a little bit about this sort of background here.
You know, I worry about sounding like I'm engaging in amateur psychology, but there is something about the way in which people who have murderous intentions towards others might themselves imagine that they could be the target of murderous intentions. The more the Muslims of Damascus were taken in by a kind of bloodlust against their Christian neighbors, seeing the Christians as the problem and how much nicer life would be without the Christians around, that they began to imagine, or at least believe, that the Christians harbored the same kind of thoughts towards them, that the Christians were actively plotting the mass murder of Muslims. And so though the Muslims outnumber the Christians of Damascus by 5-1, they began to actively fear, there's almost a mass hysteria, that there was a plot brewing among Damascene Christians to rise up and catch the Muslims while they were vulnerable at Friday prayers or during the Eid itself, that really played on a kind of public hysteria. And it's captured in all the contemporary documents that I was able to consult, not just those of Mishaka and his reports, but also of several of the leading Muslim notables of the city. So one of my sources for this book, fantastic in its granularity, are the kind of diary recollections of the preacher of the celebrated Umayyad Mosque, the most important religious institution in Damascus. And he just records how fear swept the Muslims on the lead up to Eid to such a degree that when, in the past, his mosque would have been full of celebrants for the Eid, virtually he got 2 rows of worshippers coming to pray in what would otherwise have been a totally full prayer hall. Even the governor of Damascus didn't put in an appearance, which just convinced so many of the Muslim Damascenes it wasn't safe to go out. And almost as if to exacerbate those fears, the one thing the governor did do was post some of the few troops he had, swords drawn, outside the gates of mosques, as if they were there to confront a real and present danger to the Muslims of Damascus. And there were rumors circulating about the ways in which Christians had risen up against the praying Muslims in Jerusalem, or in Homs, or in Hama. So all these wild and unsubstantiated rumor, alongside the kind of bloodlust that the Druze violence against Maronites had engendered, created something of a psychological maelstrom that took Damascus out of the realm of the rational and into the brink of the psychotic.
Indeed, and actually, if we started to talk about this Ahmed Pasha, the governor, what was his sort of response to what was happening in Mount Lebanon, and as things started to build up in Damascus? You sort of touched on a little bit about him stationing troops outside of certain mosques, and this created the impression the massacre was about to happen, and also didn't attend Friday prayers as he would normally do. But what was his sort of, how did he sort of, because obviously as governor of Damascus, his role was to sort of calm tensions, but he doesn't do that. Talk to us a little bit about what he's thinking at this time and what he actually does.
The Ottoman governor to Damascus, Ahmed Pasha, remains a total enigma to the historian. There's a glowing biography of the man written by one of the sort of encyclopedists, or the group biographers of the age, a man by the name of Bitor. And were you to read the account of Ahmed Pasha he provides, you would assume that he was a paragon of virtue. But when you read the reports of contemporaries, and Mishaka here was absolutely convinced that behind the seeming passivity of Ahmed Pasha in his failure to respond to the escalation of tensions, or the hostilities shown by the Muslim community or Druze circulating in the countryside around Damascus, his failure to intervene effectively to calm the tensions, to uphold law and order, led Mishaka to condemn Ahmed Pasha of actual complicity in the massacre, as though he willed the massacres to happen. From my reading of the documents, I'm left with the impression of a man who had ill will towards the Christian community of Damascus, who wished to demonstrate to the central government in Istanbul the danger of some of the reforms that they were imposing that were so destabilizing to the social order, such as this measure to grant legal equality to Muslim and non-Muslim alike. It seemed a sort of measure that offended conservative Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, and I think Ahmed Pasha might have ranked among their numbers. And then I think he was someone who was paralyzed by the magnitude of the events that began to unfold, as though once things started turning to crisis and to killing, he just froze. I have one report from the man that I found in the Ottoman archives. It's the only report I have found by Ahmed Pasha addressing the events as they unfolded. He wrote it 3 or 4 days into the events, but while they were still ongoing. And the document reads like the writing of someone in total delusion, as though this were a situation that were a mere dust-up that he would soon have under control. And if anything, he blamed the Ottoman state for not having left him enough of his garrison to be able to deal effectively with maintaining calm within the city and within his jurisdiction. And in that way, trying to deflect blame, but promising that he would soon have order restored and that the damage wouldn't be too bad. And this at a point where already, the worst of the killing had happened, and the Christian quarters had already been set to the torch, and the smoke was billowing over the city as he penned his report with a false illusion of calm. He would pay for his failings. He would be, in the end, arrested, put on trial, found guilty, and the Ottoman state would ultimately execute the man for his responsibility for this dreadful massacre. But it's hard to know to what degree it was a massacre of his making or a situation that simply went beyond his control, escaped his control. I really cannot be more precise. You read some of the sources, they have built whole theories about his responsibility for the events, but you read the documents and it's very hard to confirm one way or the other what was going through the man's mind.
Indeed, and he was actually quite slow as well to tell the Ottoman central state of what was happening as well, which, further adds to the sort of sense that he either willed it to happen or he just didn't want to do anything because he feared the mob's retaliation against himself, which is something you sort of mentioned. But let's talk about the actual events themselves. How did the massacre sort of begin?
Well, you have a city that's literally on the edge of violence. And so really that powder keg only needs a spark to explode. And in the event, it was something rather minor. Crosses appeared on the streets of the Christian quarter, and young hooligans were trying to force Christian passerbys to walk over the crosses in a kind of bullying way to make them defile the symbol of their faith. And members of the Christian community went straight to the governor's offices to complain about this and to demand something be done. And here we see the governor take decisive action, and he sent a group of police who rounded up a group of young men. No due process here. He clapped them in manacles, put them in jail, and the next day sent them out with brooms to sweep the Christian quarters of all these chalk crosses. The sight of young Muslims in manacles with brooms like common criminals without any due process so outraged the Muslims in the old city that the merchants began to shutter their shops. Their families began to call on their neighbors to liberate the prisoners and to go and punish the Christians for usurping the role of, the respected Muslims of the city and leaving them reduced to common criminals. And what followed then was the building of a mob. The shuttering of the shops is always a very ominous sign in central Damascus. On the one hand, it suggests that people expect violence, and on the other, it means that the shopkeepers have left the regular business of trade to take part in mob violence. And within minutes, you had the masses of hundreds growing to thousands, making their way towards the eastern side of the walled city to Bab Tuma, Bab Sharki, where the Christian communities were concentrated. And what followed were attacks of people breaking into Christian homes, robbing the houses, murdering the men, in many cases raping or kidnapping the women, taking away children. And then only when they had satisfied themselves that they had emptied the houses of literally everything of any value to then set fire to Christian houses. And so the chant was sort of rob, kill, burn. And that was the formula that the mob pursued in what was 8 days of relentless violence, in which the Ottoman authorities, not led by the governor Ahmed Pasha, simply stayed in the barracks, letting things unfold without really making a significant intervention to stop the violence. Some police sent out, some barricades put up, but they were soon overwhelmed. And there were even many reports of policemen or irregular soldiers joining the mob to take part in the havoc, the robbery, the killing.
So talk to us about who the rioters and the people carrying out the massacre were, because in the sort of book you sort of point out that it's not simply people from Damascus, you had people coming in from elsewhere. Not all of them were Sunni Muslims, and this is an important point because sometimes I think you wrote that sometimes when a Christian would come across the Muslim, thinking they were in front of a Muslim mob, would convert to Islam as a way of trying to save themselves. And if that mob was actually Sunni Muslim, it might work. A lot of the time they weren't Sunni Muslim, and so it didn't work. So talk to us about who the actual people carrying out the massacre were.
Well, it's an interesting question because, of course, there were no polls being taken at the time to give you a reliable portrait. When you read the contemporary sources, and two of the Muslim notables whose diaries I used describe the mob in very, very heterogeneous terms. So they talk about Yazidis, Druze, Shiites. They talk about villagers from neighboring villages. They talk about Bedouin. They talk about the lower classes or the rabble of Damascus. They talk about the Kurds from the various peripheral neighborhoods of the city. They're not only trying to shift the blame away from the kind of Sunni Arab Muslim community, but they're also trying to inject a class dimension here and say that the notables or the elites of Damascus had nothing to do with this. And in this, they of course have an interest because the Muslim notables played a very important intermediary role between the masses and the government, something that my predecessor here at Oxford, Al-Buturani, referred to as the politics of the notables. And the notables knew that the Ottoman state would hold them first and foremost responsible for the breakdown in order. So you have this attempt to try and distance both the elites as a class and the Sunni Muslims as a community from the murderous mob itself. But it was overwhelmingly, by all accounts, a Sunni Muslim mob reinforced by other minority communities who were drawn into Damascus less out of hatred of Christians and more out of opportunism. If there was going to be a plundering of rich Christian houses, then anyone of the lower classes would have an interest in getting into the action to try and enrich themselves in this moment of looting. So the crowd, as far as we can tell, if you read some of the Christian sources, they will also lay blame on some of the militia leaders and the irregular troops and the police who they witnessed taking part in these events. And because these are people already given arms by the Ottoman government, they were guilty of using arms against civilians in the killing that took place. They would pay for their lives with that when they were prosecuted by the Ottoman state after the events. But a very heterogeneous crowd, mostly opportunists, but people who, once they had started in the killing, seemed to get into a frenzy of killing and of robbing and of burning that was to go on for the full 8 days of the events.
It's also interesting to point out here as well that the authorities did very little over those 8 days, but there was people, usually at the individual level, trying to intervene to do things. So you did have cases where Muslim notables and others in their local street would try to protect Christian communities and protect Christian individuals. And of course, who we've mentioned earlier, Abdul Kader, played a massive role in that as well. Could you talk to us about this response?
It's such an important point, Osman, because there is this tendency to talk about Muslim violence on Christians, yet the saviors of the Christian community were Muslim elites, appalled by the violence being done to their Christian neighbors, who stepped in to provide a kind of safe house to Christian survivors. And so we have accounts of, a score of notables whose homes became a safe refuge for their Christian neighbors, and very soon became completely filled to overflowing. And I tried to list every one of those Muslim notables who intervened because you have to honor their memory for the courage they showed in standing up against the crowd violence to protect their Christian neighbors. But you're right, the person who stood out as making the largest contribution to rescuing Christians was certainly the Algerian Emir Abdelkadir. Abdelkadir, since taking refuge in Damascus in 1855, had been a magnet to veterans of the Algerian conflict who, not wanting to live under French imperial rule, had chosen to go into exile with their leader and flocked to Damascus. So he had a community of about 1,200 armed men who had once fought the wars with him and now gave him total loyalty. And as I said before, his bond to French Emperor Napoleon III had turned Abdelkadir from foe of the French to ally of the French. They relied on him very much as their eyes and ears on a volatile Damascus. Abdelkadir had persuaded the French consul to arm his Algerian retainers so that with the growing tensions from the overflow of violence in Mount Lebanon to the area around Damascus, he would have at his disposal dependable and disciplined fighters who might intervene in the case of a breakdown of order, which he quite rightly predicted as a risk at any moment. And so when violence did break out, it was Abdelkadir who would be in a position to send 20 or 30 armed Algerians to go and rescue Christians from their houses and bring them back to safety, either at his own home or in the house of the British consul, which was becoming another safety deposit area, or when all the safe houses became overcrowded, he secured from the governor, Ahmed Pasha, access to the citadel of Damascus, which had a large open space about the size of 6 football pitches, which could accommodate thousands of displaced people. It was obviously very frightening for the Christians to take on trust that once admitted to the citadel of Damascus, that they wouldn't face a sort of forcing of the gates by the mobs, and then the kind of massacre which had occurred in many of the gated citadels of the towns of Mount Lebanon, places like Hasbaya or Rashaya or Deir al-Qamar, where Christians in citadels found themselves victims of mass murder. But the gates of the citadel of Damascus were protected by Abdelkadir's retainers, and in this way, a good 11 or 12,000 Christians were taken from the quarters to the security of the citadel, where, protected by Algerian armed retainers of Abdelkadir, they were able to withstand the remainder of the massacre. In this way, yes, about 85% of the Christian community will survive the massacre. About 2,500 Damascene Christians killed, as you said, but I would add another 2,500 Christians killed, refugees from surrounding towns and villages who took refuge in the city of Damascus just before the outbreak of the violence there. And having overflowed churches and monasteries, many of them were sleeping rough in the streets of Damascus and were the first to be killed by the marauding crowds who went through the city. So 2,500 Damascenes, about 5,000 Christians killed in total in Damascus. A horror. And yet, the city was spared a genocide by the actions of Abdelkadir and other Muslim notables in saving 85% of the Damascus of Christians in the course of the events.
So could you talk to us then about how did the Ottoman central state, Istanbul, learn of the actual events, and what was their response once they did get a sort of idea of what was happening?
It took days before Istanbul became aware of the breakdown in order, first in Mount Lebanon and then in Damascus. But they knew that this was going to be an event of the most serious magnitude. The massacring of Christians in the Levant would inevitably attract the attention of the European powers, who, having declared themselves protectors of the different Christian communities in the Ottoman Empire, would almost certainly intervene. The Ottomans were rightly afraid that this could be the pretext for a kind of partition or colonial response by France or Russia, and they were very quick to designate one of their most sort of respected and distinguished statesmen, the foreign minister Fuad Pasha. Fuad was one of the men of the Tanzimat. He was responsible for large parts of the 1856 decree, which was to give legal equality to Muslims and non-Muslims. So in that sense, he was someone who had a stake in upholding the new reform order of the Tanzimat. He also was fluent in French, had extensive experience of working with the European diplomats. So he was the right man for the job. No sooner was he given his credentials than news of the violence of Damascus complicated that of Mount Lebanon. And he redoubled the speed of his mission to the Eastern Mediterranean, and was there when the first of the European responses came through, namely the dispatch of a French army of 6,000 men and the dispatch of a European commission to advise the Ottomans on the restoration of order and the creation of a new administrative structure for Mount Lebanon in particular. And from that point forward, Fuad would be charged not with just trying to reestablish the state's control over the completely broken province of Damascus, but also to try and control the European powers' intervention, that what happened in Lebanon and Damascus would not lead to a kind of colonial outcome. So the stakes could not have been higher. And it's only, with hindsight, we can realize how capable Fuad was to prove, given the challenges he faced.
And he does come down quite hard, and as you've sort of already mentioned earlier about Ahmed Pasha, what he did to Ahmed Pasha, but he came into Damascus, and once sort of order started to return, he starts to investigate what happened and starts to mete out punishments as well, doesn't he?
Well, Fuad saw in the notables of Damascus the real culprits, as well as the governor, Ahmed Pasha. They failed to hold in check the working people of Damascus, the mass of the population that they, as the social contract went, were responsible for the state to try and serve as intermediaries. Moreover, he saw in their action subversion against the new reform order that he was himself very committed to. These were people in their conservatism who rejected the reforms of the Tanzimat, rejected the 1856 decree. So he had no sympathy for them or their political worldview. He saw them as really the enemy of the new order of the Ottoman Empire that he was playing such a key role in penning. So he found no difficulty in standing up to these notables in the severest terms and threatening them with either cooperating with his mission to restore order and to punish the guilty, or else pay for it themselves. And he, no small way intimidates the notables. He locks them up. He forces them to reveal the names of people in their own town quarters who were responsible. He wants them to denounce other notables. He wants names. And either they deliver others to the noose or they'll wear the noose themselves. And in the end, most of them crack. Some of them actually lead meetings with Fuad Pasha and flee into exile rather than to cave. The loyalties of the Damascene notables to their town quarters was very strong, and their fear of Fuad was very real. But in the course of the first month, he was able to round up thousands of leading notables from the Muslim community, as well as common working people, distributed them around several places of incarceration in Damascus, and then organized a tribunal to hear evidence against these people. And for those that he could find incontrovertible evidence, immediate punishments followed, from the severest of capital punishment to imprisonment and exile. And in this very decisive action to demonstrate to the people of Damascus that the Ottoman state was back and demanded their submission to law and order, and to the European powers that the Ottomans had the situation very firmly under control and did not need the Europeans to intervene in Damascus for sure, and in a very controlled way in Mount Lebanon.
So talk to us then, because you sort of say this in the book as well, that following all of this and after all the punishments are meted out, the Ottomans then decide they need to sort of rebuild Syrian society, effectively Damascene society, and major changes occur within Damascus after this period, to the point where the idea of a massacre like this happening again 20, 30 years later seemed improbable. So talk to us about how the Ottomans sort of put Damascus back together again.
Well, in a sense, that's my favorite part of the book. If you like, the book has a terrible start. In the middle of the book, it's absolutely atrocious. And then the second half of the book is a kind of roadmap to how a government can, through sensible action, bring a society back from the brink. And I look on the reconstruction efforts in Damascus, which were by no means a quick fix. Reconstruction takes at least 4 years. And then the reconsolidation and the reintegration of the Christian community into the life of the city with really no discrimination, I would say takes 25 years. So this is a slow and deliberate process, but it goes to show how you can actually take a society after such a deeply divisive trauma and heal it. And I guess in the first instance, the measures taken to bring law and order were the most volatile. Fuad Pasha hangs 57 Muslims from street corners near where they were accused of committing their crimes, many of them respected notables of the city, and 110 men from the police and the irregular armed forces were taken to a field near the center of Damascus and shot by firing squad. So these draconian measures raised such profound resentments by the Muslim community that many predicted another wave of massacre against the Christians. It was so volatile. In the aftermath of that, the measures to try and raise the money to rebuild, the money could only come from the Muslim community of Damascus and Greater Syria. The Ottoman government itself in Istanbul was experiencing tremendous financial difficulties, and was borrowing money from European capitals to try just to make their own budget meet ends. There's no surplus for them to be able to inject state money into rebuilding Damascus. So after these draconian punishments of hangings and executions and exiles, then you have a kind of indemnity tax in which both Muslims guilty of participation in the events and those innocent of any participation were alike taxed for sizable amounts of money to create an indemnity fund. And that fund was in no way going to be sufficient to repay the surviving Christians of Damascus, who, by the way, lost everything. They escaped with their clothes on their back, but their homes, their savings, the tools of their trade, all gone. And the Ottomans really had to provide everything for the 85% of the surviving Christians of Damascus. So the indemnity tax raises great antagonism by the Muslims again the threat of new massacres. It also raised great discontent among the Christians, who got only a fraction of their losses, but it was enough for them to rebuild their homes, put a roof over their heads, to establish the basic tools of the trade, go back to work, to resume the place that they had in the economy of Damascus, which suffered a death spiral after the events, losing the Christian injection into the economy of Damascus and the damage done to the city's fabric. And it's only then, I would say, sort of in the later 1860s, the 1870s, and 1880s, when the Ottomans take the decision to, as part of the Tanzimat reforms, restructure provincial government. And they bring together three separate provinces: Beirut, then called the province of Sidon, but we'll call it Beirut, Jerusalem, and Damascus, into one big super province, with Damascus as its capital. And suddenly the governor of Damascus has over 5 times the revenues coming through his hands. Can't spend it all in Damascus, still has to service the needs of Jerusalem and of Beirut, but far more resources with which to begin what I describe as a kind of spending spree on investing in building new infrastructure, roads, telegraphs, speeding up communications within the province and enhancing the market's connectivity, and then building new markets. The expansion of the markets of Damascus in the 1870s and 80s was remarkable and turned the kind of back alleyways of a backwards Damascus into the modern markets of broad streets that could accommodate two-way wheeled traffic, with beautiful new shops built on the kind of model of European arcades, such as you'll see off Piccadilly in London or in Milan in Italy. So this new model of an urban center providing luxurious new shopping spaces in places like Souk Midhat Pasha or the Souk Hamidiyya, which is transformative and benefits merchants of all religious communities equally, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, hiring shops in these beautiful new markets. And then, of course, an expansion of the Ottoman bureaucracy leads to lots of Ottoman government buildings being built. That's great for the building trade. It also creates many more jobs in the bureaucracy. These are being held by Muslims, but also Christians and Jews, which means that there's more of a meeting space in the workplace between the different communities of Damascus, working together, coming to common decisions in the interests of their city rather than of their individual communities. And that overflows into leisure spaces, the cafes, the theaters, where people begin to mix and mingle again, and the schools, where the government invests in the schools that provide the educational opportunities, not just for the Christians through the missionary schools, but the Maktab Anbar, which will be the most luxurious Ottoman school open in Syria in this period, providing the kind of education that was a real door opener for young Damascenes of all backgrounds to gain access to the best of Ottoman jobs. So it's a kind of investment in the transformation of a city that provides opportunities for all of its communities and essentially a better future for the next generation. To me, it is that one element, the better future for the next generation, that would give all the communities of Damascus the motive to bury the hatchet and turn the page.
That sounds like a very good place to sort of end this discussion. It was a great pleasure talking to you, Professor Eugene Rogan. Thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversation.
Pleasure to be with you, Osman. Thank you for the chance.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to catch up with this one or previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website, but please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.